Alright, let's go ahead and begin this week's lecture on campaigns and elections. If you guys haven't noticed already, I did post the announcement on the course website that we're going to go ahead and split this lecture into two parts. So week 10, according to your course schedule, will also be campaigns and elections. I have decided to eliminate the week 15 lecture on civil liberties and civil rights. It's not that it's not important, it's just that there's so much to cover with campaigns and elections, and I really feel that this is something that you guys really need to know about, because it's definitely part of the political process that you guys will probably participate in the most is campaigns and elections. And it's probably the one that you guys will hear about the most, at least being part of the American media and things like that. So campaigns and elections are very important, so I decided to go ahead and split this week's lecture. Instead of making it in one 3-hour-long lecture, I decided to make it into two separate parts. And so today we're just going to talk about campaigns and elections, and then next week we'll talk about campaign finance and voting and things like that. So let's go ahead and begin this week with campaigns and elections, and we're going to go ahead and first begin with elections themselves. Now, elections and campaigns are very, very closely related. Campaigns are part of an election, so that's why we have certain terms such as election campaign. So let's go ahead and tackle what an election campaign is. By definition, an election campaign is just an organized effort to get voters to choose one candidate over others competing for office. So you have two candidates, or more often, that are competing for one office. They're competing for one particular office, now whether that be governor or president or senator or House Representatives member, things like that. All election campaigns are an organized effort to achieve that office against other competitors. There's different types of elections too. Now these are all part of the election campaign, but we must first deal with the primary elections. The primary elections come before the general election, which we'll talk about on the next slide. So first, the primary election. The primary election is just a preliminary election conducted by the party to select candidates to run for public office. Subsequent elections are against other party candidates. So, in a primary election, you have two competitors from the same party. It's conducted by one party to select candidates to run for public office in subsequent elections, which will be the general election. Now, we also need to talk about caucuses real quick. Caucuses are a form of primary election. It's just where registered party members get together in small meetings to select candidates, not used as frequently. We're going to have another slide on caucuses here in just a little bit. But just know for now that the caucus is a type of primary election. Now, after the primary election, then you have the general election. So the winner of the primary election, when you're facing off against each other in the primary election, then you have the general election as soon as those candidates are selected. And then the general election is just where you have usually Republican versus Democrat, and it's the process by which individuals vote to determine the outcomes for the public office. Now, general election, normally you would have a winner. They would either vote for the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate, whatever election it may be. Now, there are times where a runoff election is necessary. A runoff election is just when no one candidate receives the majority of votes. So there's not a majority. No one got that 50% plus one to actually win the general election. So in that case, you need to have a runoff election. And this happened most recently in Texas. You had Dewhurst versus Patrick, and it was a primary election. So both Dewhurst and Patrick were Republican candidates. And no candidate between these two for the office that they were fighting for, neither one of them got a majority. So we needed to have a runoff election, which ultimately Dewhurst won. So that's just an example of a runoff election where no one candidate receives a majority, and so after the after the election itself, whether it be primary or general, you need to have a runoff election. So there's also such thing as a special election, and this just happens when maybe a legislator dies or resigns or is removed from office. So that's the example of a special election. Now, let's go back to primaries really quick, because primaries are necessary before we can get into the general election material. So the primary elections happen in each state. And it's where, remember, two candidates from the same party are facing each other. But there's different primary election types. You can have a closed primary, an open primary, and a semi-closed primary. Now, a closed primary is where voters go to register before the election date And voters must register with a particular party. Most of them will either check Republican or Democrat here in America. You may also check independent or things like that. But in a closed primary, voters must register with the party affiliation, and you can only vote in that party's primary. So if you register Republican, you can only vote in a Republican primary. If you registered as a Democrat, you can only vote in the Democratic primary. So that's an example of a closed primary. And in a closed primary, if you register as an independent, well, tough luck. You can't vote in any of the primaries because you registered as independent. Only voters of that party registration can vote in that party's primary. Now there's also an open primary, and open primaries are really fast and loose. Open primaries is where voters, regardless of party registration or affiliation, can choose candidates from any primary. So regardless of how you registered, you may have registered as a Republican or you may have registered as a Democrat. Well, you can go vote in the opposite party's primary if you want to. And Texas has an open primary because when Texas voters go and register for a party, when Texas voters go and register to vote, they don't actually have to select a party itself. So they don't register as Republican or Democrat. But regardless of their personal party affiliation, they can go vote in whichever primary they want. So Democrats from Texas can vote in Republican primaries. Republicans from Texas can go vote in Democratic primaries. Now in Texas, because Texas is such a Republican state, most Democrats will actually choose to go vote in the Republican primary to maybe try to get a candidate that maybe closely reflects their political views, or to maybe even go vote for a fringe candidate and kind of sabotage the election in a sort of way. So that's why Texas has a really fun political system, is that really the opposite party could actually sabotage the other party if they wanted to. Now, typically in Texas, because Texas is so deeply red and it's typically a Republican state, it doesn't really matter all that much. But it is very interesting to kind of think about. Now, there is such thing as also a semi-closed primary, and this is just basically where voters that are registered with that one party may only vote in that party's primary, just like in a closed primary. But those unaffiliated voters, such as independents, can vote in either party primary. So that's kind of a semi-closed primary, where voters that are registered with a particular party still vote in that party's primary election, but unaffiliated voters are allowed to vote, whereas in a closed primary, they're not allowed to vote. So if you're interested in primary process by state, I've provided this link here, and you can go and see which states have open primaries, which states have closed primaries, and which states have semi-closed primaries. In addition, I will also be posting a video, an additional video about primary types, so I would definitely recommend watching that as well. A lot of good information on there, and maybe it'll give you a better idea of the exact differences between these three, and also help you out on your test for review as well. So those are primaries, but we also need to talk about caucuses as well. Caucuses are a special type of primary, like I mentioned on a couple slides ago. And in caucuses, you're still trying to select a candidate for that office, but you're typically only doing it for the president. So this is for presidential primaries, which about this time next year, we will be engaged in a presidential primary for 2016 presidential election. So it's good to know this kind of information now in terms of caucuses. And Texas actually does hold a caucus, so we're one of the 13 states that hold a caucuses. Remember that these are exclusively for presidential primaries, and they're used to determine the number of delegates a candidate will receive at the national convention. We're not going to talk about national conventions in today's lecture, but I am going to go ahead and post that YouTube video, which also talks about the national convention. So it's good to also watch that YouTube video for that reason. Now, caucuses happen in a determined time and place. So the party, either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, will announce ahead of time that all members of the Democratic Party need to meet at this time in this place, and all Republican members need to meet at this time in this place. And it's usually a schoolhouse or a courthouse or some sort of public meeting place. I don't mean a schoolhouse, I mean like a school gym. That's kind of what it's, we're not in the 1930s. So at these primaries, you have what are called corners. And so in one corner, let's say over here, over in the far right, there is, I'll use the 2012 presidential sample here. So in 2012, there would be a corner for Mitt Romney, there would be a corner for Newt Gingrich, and there would be a corner for Rick Santorum. And so if you support either of those candidates, you'll go over to their corner, and you'll caucus for that presidential nomination. But if you're undecided, you'll kind of sit in the center of the room, and you'll kind of go around to each member or each presidential nomination corner, and then you'll kind of hear them out. And if you agree with them, then you'll stand in their corner. And if you disagree with them, then you'll move on to the next one. And you kind of continue this process until everyone in the room has selected a corner. And now this can last for hours. And that's why caucuses aren't used as much, because it's very, very time consuming. And so that the good thing is, though, you can physically see the amount of support for each candidate based on the number of people that are standing in each corner. But it is a longer process trying to get everyone into a corner, and there's some really stubborn people out there, let's just face it. So to get everyone into a corner takes a really long time. They usually start around 7 p.m. and usually end around 9 or 10 p.m., so quite a long process, depending on how much presidential support there is in each caucus. So that's just an idea of a caucus. I don't know if I explained it that well. It's a lot easier to explain in an actual physical classroom because I can actually use the corners themselves. But if you have any questions about that, please let me know. And also, like I said, I'm going to post that YouTube video for review. So those are primary elections. You have the primary elections with the semi-closed, the closed, and the open, and you also have caucuses as well for the presidential primaries. Let's go ahead and talk about the general election. So after we sorted out all the candidates and we've gone through all the primary election process, then we'll actually have the general election. And the general elections, particularly for Congress members and for the presidential elections, happen on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November on even-numbered years. It's always the first Tuesday after the first Monday. That is how it is written into federal law, is that general elections have to occur on the first Tuesday after the first Monday. And I'm kind of repeating that because I can guarantee there will be a question on your test about that. That general elections happen on the first Tuesday after the first Monday of November on even-numbered years. So keep that in mind for your test. Every 2 years, though, we have a general election for all the House seats in the U.S. House of Representatives. House of Representative members are up for election every 2 years, so they're consistently on the campaign trail. They're always campaigning. They're always trying to gain election, and that's why they're a little less busy in Washington and a little bit more busy back at home. At the same time, also, you have 1/3 of the U.S. Senate seats. Remember when we talked about Congress and how the Senate overlaps in 6-year terms? So therefore you have 1/3 of the U.S. Senate seats every 2 years. And then every 2 years you have a lot of state and local offices. Those tend to be on opposite years of the presidential election, but some years on presidential elections you also have state and local offices up for grabs. Every 4 years, though, we choose our president. Every 4 years, voters choose the president indirectly through the Electoral College. I know we talked about the Electoral College last time. We're going to talk about it just a little bit more today, just to reinforce those ideas for your test. Each party has a slate of electors set to go in their case, in case the candidate carries the state. If the president wins that particular state, the electors are ready to vote in the Electoral College. December, after the November election, the slate of electors go to the state capitol and vote. They'll go to the state capitol, and then they'll vote, and then they'll send those electoral college results on to Washington, D.C., where the final votes are counted in the Senate. Now, with the electoral college, you might have this faithless elector issue, and that's just the idea that, let's say, Texas voted Republican, which seems quite obvious, but you may have a faithless elector in the Electoral College, which will maybe vote Democrat, just to send a message that, hey, I'm different and I think Democrats should be represented in Texas somehow, so I'll vote Democrat as my elector, as an elector in the Electoral College. It doesn't happen that often. I provided the link right here if you want to see how often it happens. Last time it happened was in 2000 during the Gore and Bush election, and it doesn't happen quite that often, but it can happen. And so the faithless elector issue is something that you should probably discuss. And I say you should probably discuss it because it is in your discussion board questions for this week, so think about that. But for the most part, the Electoral College is a winner-take-all system, except for Maine and Nebraska. And I'm going to explain Maine and Nebraska in just a few slides here and how their Electoral College system works. So let's go ahead and talk about the Electoral College just a little bit more. The Electoral College is set in the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1. The President is a unitary executive with one power, and the President selected by the Electoral College, as stated in Article 2, Section 1. Remember that the President must be 35 years or older, and have lived in the U.S. for the 14 years, and must be a natural-born citizen. So those are the 3 requirements to be president. And you must be selected by the Electoral College. Now, if you remember last week, I talked about the Obama controversy and the McCain controversy, so there's really no need to hash that. I just kind of copy and pasted the slides over into this week's lecture. So those are the requirements to be president. I can guarantee there will be a question on your test about the requirements to be president, so be sure to maybe pause this YouTube video and review those and write those in your notebook, or just be sure to know those for your test. So Electoral College. We talked about this last week, but I really want to rehash it because it can be kind of confusing and not quite clear. So Electoral College, remember, has 538 electors. There are 100 for the Senate, 435 for the U.S. House of Representatives, and then 3 for D.C. Now, 538 divided by 2 is 269, but you have to get a majority. You want a majority, and 269 is even. It's not a majority. The majority would be 270 because it would be that half plus 1. So you need 270 to win the Electoral College. If you remember, we talked about Texas. Texas has 36 House of Representative members plus their 2 senators. So 36 plus 2 equals 38 Electoral College votes for Texas. Texas has voted Republican the last 2 decades. Typically those 38 electors go automatically to the Republican side. Just as in California. California has 55 Electoral College votes, so those 55 typically automatically go to a Democrat. Now, the Electoral College, remember we talked about this last time, means that the president can win the Electoral College and lose the popular vote. That's what we saw with the Bush versus Gore example there, where Bush lost the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College, so he became president. The Electoral College, the idea behind it was that it would allow states to be key in the selection because each state has an individual worth, and that individual worth reflects their voice in the presidential selection. So it allows for states to be key in the selection, and if you remember, like I talked about last time, is that it's based on the number of senators plus representatives. And so if you want to review the formula, I've provided that down here for you. No real need to review that much, except for there's 1 elector for every U.S. House of Representatives plus their 2 senators, and then 3 votes for the District of Columbia. We also talked last time about the elections that had trouble. So that's the Electoral College in a nutshell. It's a winner-take-all system, so if you win that particular state, you get that many electors. Now, Nebraska and Maine are just a little bit different. How Nebraska and Maine work is they really look at the congressional district level. So, if a candidate wins a district, they receive 1 elector from that district. The winner of the popular vote in that seat receives the 2 electors from the senators. So, here's your example here. Nebraska has 3 districts plus 2 senators. That equals 5 electors. Nebraska has 5 electors total. Now, what could happen is that if you look at each congressional election, let's use the 2012 example, Obama could win 1 district in Nebraska and then Romney win 2. Romney also won the popular vote in Nebraska. Nebraska is typically a Republican state, so Romney won that state with the popular vote. But Obama did win 1 district. So Obama still gets 1 elector, but Romney gets the 2 from the other districts, and then the 2 for the senators. So Romney equals 4, Obama equals 1. So they split up this vote of 5. They split up this 5 between them, 4-1 for Romney. So Nebraska splits its electors up 4-1 in favor of Romney. Maine has only 2 congressional districts plus 2 senators, so you could have a 1-3 split or even a 2-2 split. Well, I'm trying to think if you could have a 2-2 split. Not quite sure. Let me try to work that out just a little bit later. But you get the point. If you win a congressional district, you get that 1 elector from there, plus the popular vote is an additional 2 points as well. So that's how Nebraska and Maine work. If you have any questions about it, please let me know. There won't be a specific question about it on your test, but it's good to know how that works, particularly because when we talk about reforming the Electoral College, which you guys will talk about in your discussion boards this week, it's something to think about. Maybe what if the system did switch to Nebraska and Maine? So let's go ahead and explore that right now. So this is how the Electoral College panned out in 2008. In 2008, you had largely a lot of Republican support here in the middle. And this little shape, you have this little red kind of L right here shape, where you have the northern Great Plains states down into the south, which typically are Republican states. And this is what many political scientists today call the Republican L. because it's this nice little L shape. And in 2008, you had Obama versus McCain. Obama had a lot of support nationwide, and he ended up winning the election, if you can see here, 365 to 173. Obama picked up states such as North Carolina and Indiana, which are typically red states, or at least North Carolina is at least considered a swing state by some regards. But Obama had strong nationwide support, and so he won 365 to 173. But this was, once again, the winner-take-all system. And in 2012, we had the winner-take-all system as well, but Obama ended up losing some support in certain places. If you see Indiana and North Carolina went back to red, and Indiana went back to its typical red as well. But you have the Republican L shape here still, and Obama still ended up winning 303 Electoral College votes. So that's just trying to give you an idea of how the Electoral College kind of works. You guys played around with the theoretical Electoral College map last time, so I hope you guys learned something doing that. But I just kind of wanted to give you an idea of the Electoral College as it stands today. Now let's entertain the idea that every other state switches to the same system as Nebraska and Maine. What would that look like? Because while these are red states, there may be pockets of blue congressional districts, same as it would be in Texas. You can maybe think of the urban centers in Texas, which tend to vote more democratically. And it's the same way in, let's say, a blue state, such as New York. There's definitely red pockets in more rural upstate New York where those congressional districts could change to red, and so therefore part of these 29 votes would go to Romney, and part of these 38 votes would go to Obama down here in Texas. So what would that look like? Let's go ahead and look at the map. If every state was like Nebraska and Maine, sorry, I put a comparison there, I just wanted to show how much support that Obama had lost, and then how 2008 versus 2012 compared. But what if every state was like Nebraska and Maine? You can definitely see that this would definitely swing the favor in favor of Romney, because you have these red pockets in blue states such as New York and Michigan, and then you definitely have the red pockets here in Colorado as well. This tends to be the Denver area around here, tends to be more blue, but the rest of the state tends to be red. Now you also see here in Texas that Texas votes Democratic in certain spots, particularly in the more urban areas, but for the most part stays red. So it's just an entertaining thought. What if every state was like Nebraska and Maine? What if every state split its votes based on congressional district plus the two votes for the senators based on the popular vote? What would that look like? Well, it would look like this, and Republicans would have a better chance to win compared to the losses they suffered in 2008 and 2012, because states like Illinois, which is a blue state through and through, does have red pockets in more rural areas, and same with New York, same with Colorado, and things like that. So you can kind of see the idea I'm trying to get at here. So it's just an entertaining thought. Think about it for your discussion board, and it might maybe gives a voice to those areas that don't have those, that are overwhelmed by the urban populations and things like that. So sorry if I'm just kind of rambling here, but just something to entertain the idea of. So, all right. Now we also need to think about the idea of what if there is no electoral college majority? What if that faithless elector issue came up? What if two people both received 268 votes? None of them got to 269, none of them got to 270. What happens then? If there's no electoral college majority, we simply follow this procedure. The Senate is responsible for electing the vice president from two vice presidential candidates with electoral college votes. Now that makes sense that the Senate would elect the vice president, because if you remember when we talked about Congress, who is the president of the Senate? Well, it's the vice president. So they're kind of electing their own president in many ways. So you select the vice president from the two vice presidential candidates with electoral college votes. Each senator casts one vote for the vice president. The House is responsible for electing the president. The House is supposedly, or at least symbolically, more representative of the population at large, so therefore the House elects the president from three candidates who receive the most electoral college votes, and each state delegation has one vote. So there's 50 votes total. So all of the delegates from California, all the delegates from Texas, all the delegates from Kansas, they all get together and then they cast one vote based on how they reasoned with each other and how they felt that the state would vote itself. So the state delegation not each individual House member, but the state delegation has one vote, and they vote out of the 3 candidates. If the House fails to elect the president by Inauguration Day, the vice president-elect serves as acting president until the deadlock is resolved. And in the 2000 election, just to briefly mention that, you had the January 3rd, you had a new Congress. The Senate was 50-50 VP, was 50-50% split on who the president should, or who the vice president should be. They were split on that. And remember, Vice President Gore was the vice president at the time, and since it was a 50-50 split, Gore had the deciding vote to break the tie in the Senate for vice president. So who do you think he was going to select? He's one of the presidential nominations. Of course, he would have voted for his own VP candidate. And the House, 221 to 212, Republican delegations dominated the majority of the states. So it's an interesting kind of idea that in the 2000 election, if the Supreme Court didn't decide it in time, that you would have had a Democratic vice president and a Republican president. So it's just an interesting thought. Didn't happen in the 2000 election, but it could have happened, and it was a very exciting time in the 2000 election when it could have happened. But ultimately, the Supreme Court decided that President Bush would be the president at that time. So that's just the idea of what happens if an electoral college does not have a majority at all. So, all right, what determines presidential election outcomes? Well, quite simply, you have to look to bellwether states, and what I mean by bellwether is just those swing states that we mentioned, those swing states that can go either way. Incumbents usually win. There are some exceptions, depends on how you measure it. But usually the incumbent president will win the presidential nomination again. There are very few examples of only one-term presidents. In fact, the last one that we had was Jimmy Carter, almost 40 years ago, or almost 40 years ago now, 15 years ago, 35 years ago, 2015. So usually incumbents will win. President H.W. Bush was a one-term president. Okay. Sorry, my theory is kind of a little debunked now, but incumbents usually win, and you've seen that with President Bush, you've seen that with President Obama. Now, party in power does tend to go back and forth. You have a pattern of switching from Democrats to Republicans, to Democrats to Republicans, back to Democrats. Presidential approval has a whole lot to do with it. Presidential approval determines on whether the incumbent is going to win or not. The economy matters. The economy matters for presidential approval. And so there is this theory in political science that if the GDP grows by at least 2.6% in the second quarter of the election year, the incumbent wins. So if the GDP grows, that means the economy is growing, that means that presidential approval is going to go up, and that president will get reelected. If GDP growth is stagnant, less than 1.5%, the incumbent loses. So if the GDP growth is slow, the incumbent president will lose, and that's when you get the one-term presidents. You need a high turnout among supporters. You need to encourage some defection from the opposition. You need to reduce opposition turnout, and you need to win independent voters in order to win the presidential election. Now, like I said, you need to look to those bellwether states. You need to look to those battleground states. You need to look to the debates as well. The debates are one of the most highly watched events during the presidential campaign. So the debates will often determine who wins and who loses. And then simply don't screw it up. Just don't screw up. There's certain things that presidential nominees do that are really minute that tend to determine the election outcome. I provided a whole list of presidential nomination screw-ups, so if you kind of want some comedy, you can look through each of these. But you have both the Republicans and Democrats that have just made little minor errors that have really kind of done in their presidential campaign. So both Republicans and Democrats are listed here. Feel free to take a look at this. Some of them are really, really comical. Campaign strategies and tactics. There will be a question about these on your test, so be sure to keep these in mind. 3 basic strategies include the party-centered strategy. That just means that some people will call it the contract with America, and that just basically means that you're going to focus on what your party's going to do. This is why Republicans are better for America. This is why Democrats are better for America. You focus on the party itself, and if the party can rise itself up, then you have a good chance of winning as president because you have the backing of a solid party. There's also issue-oriented strategies. This is where you focus less on the party and you focus more on the issues. What are you going to do about it? And the common phrase here is, it's the economy, stupid. That's what a lot of people will say during presidential campaigns, is that it's the economy, stupid. You need to look at the issues behind the campaign to determine who's going to win, who's going to better handle the economy, and things like that. And then you also have the image-oriented strategy, and this became really, really popular when President Obama campaigned in 2008. He kind of gave a post-partisan message. He kind of gave this message that he was beyond party politics and that he just wants to change America. So that's why he came up with the slogan, "Yes, we can." He focused on his image and who he was, and he promoted that image as a post-partisan kind of man that could work on both sides of the aisle and get things done. Now, a lot of campaigns will have little strains of each of these three basic strategies, particularly since President Obama was so successful with his image strategy campaign. Those focuses on image have really taken off in subsequent campaigns. So campaigns definitely have elements of all three of these, but most campaigns will at least try to focus a little bit more on a particular strategy over the other. So I hope that makes some sense. Once again, if you have any questions, please let me know. Conducting a campaign, simple, just 3 steps. Now, I say simple because there's a lot that goes on, but for the most part, you need to think about how you're going to portray yourself on the campaign trail. Most candidates will spend their time in swing states, because remember, swing states are what matters most. It's where support for candidates is about equal. You need to make sure that you're swinging opposition over to your side and that you're showing that you really care about these swing states, because that's where the democratic process is really taking hold. And you need to sway opposition voters to your side, and you also need to be sure that you're kind of solidifying your support in that state. Those on the campaign trail will also spend time in states where their support is greatest. Now, you don't see many Democrats coming into Texas, and you don't see many Republicans going to California, because the support just simply isn't there. But if Republicans come to Texas, they can say, "Hey, I'm the Republican candidate. I support what you guys are doing here in Texas." And then it's also helpful for fundraising as well. So you want to spend time in states where the support is greatest, especially for fundraising, especially to solidify your base. Tackling the issues, candidates will a lot of times just use stump speeches. And these are just standard speeches that are usually less than 20 minutes long that express a candidate's belief on key issues. Negative campaigning. We're going to talk a lot about negative campaigning and where it comes from next lecture, but there is a discussion board on negative campaigning today, so it's something that I at least want you guys to start thinking about for the next lecture. Negative campaigning. Quite simply put, just tearing down your opponent. Candidates mostly use negative campaigning nowadays. If you've seen any political ad within the last election cycle, most likely it was negative. You can see here that 90% of ads at some point or another are negative. Now, the public, when they're asked about negative campaigning, most people will say, "Oh, I hate negative campaigning. I don't like it. It's terrible. It makes the candidate look bad." But the fact is that it works. Negative campaigning in studies have been shown to work far more effectively than advertising with a positive message and a positive image. The public really likes that negative sort of thing. And you can think about the media itself even. The media, like most news outlets and things like that, will produce negative stories because it works and it kind of grips the public into watching. And that's the same way with political negative campaign as well, is that the public doesn't like it, but it works and it's very effective. And you can see here that negative campaigning has really taken off in recent years. So in 2000, I don't know if you can really see the contrast on your computer or not. It shows up a lot more better here. But the deep purple right here is the negative campaign, and the light purple down here is the positive campaign. And in 2000, you had about 40% of positive message and only about 30% of negative campaigning. Flip only 12 years ahead, and unfortunately only 15% of campaign ads are now having a positive message, whereas around 65% of campaign ads are now having a negative message. Now, when I say that 90%, like I said on the last slide, it also includes this contrast sort of message as well, and also negative points as well. So negative campaigning has really taken off. And then one of your discussion board questions, it asks you, why do you believe this negative campaigning has really taken off? And it's something to think about, but we're going to actually address why it has taken off next lecture. But I at least want you guys to get to think about it this week. Now, so that's presidential elections, campaign itself. Let's talk just a little bit about what midterm elections are. I think it's very good to discuss what midterm elections are before we get into congressional elections themselves. Midterm elections are just elections on even-numbered years which do not coincide with a presidential election. So presidential elections happen in 2012, 2016, 2020. Midterm elections occur most recently in 2014, will happen again in 2018, and then 2022. They're just elections on even-numbered years which do not coincide with the presidential election. Now, in midterm elections, you don't have the presidential election at all, so you don't have a whole lot of media coverage on midterm elections, but they're very important positions because during the midterm elections, you have a lot of congressional members being elected and also governor candidates being elected. Gubernatorial elections are held typically during midterm election years. Now, because there's no presidential campaign going on and it's hard to gain support for the president's party and things like that, the president's party historically has lost seats in Congress during the midterms. So if you look at this slide over here, we can go back to President Truman in 1946. In 1946, he had a midterm election and he lost 55 House seats and 12 Senate seats. He did gain 2 Democratic governors, but that doesn't really help him a whole lot in terms of the federal government. 1950, Truman faced another midterm election. He lost 29 House seats, 6 Senate seats, and 6 governorships. Now, so that was for a Democrat, Harry Truman. Even Republicans have suffered the same thing historically. Eisenhower lost 18 House members and 1 Senate seat during his first midterm election, lost 48 House seats and 13 Senate seats during his second midterm election. Flip forward 50 plus years, you have Obama in 2012. He lost 63 seats in the House and then 6 seats in the Senate and 6 governorships as well. I didn't add the 2014 results in here yet. Sorry, just didn't get around to it, but Obama did lose more seats in Congress in the 2014 midterms as well. So midterms are usually bad for the president's party, and you just need to look at the president's party, and then you can usually determine that the opposite party will win during the midterm elections. So I just kind of wanted to show you this graph. There are just very few examples of people actually gaining seats. You have Bush in 2002 who gained a few seats because there was the need for solidarity after 9/11 and things like that. And then you also have Clinton in 98. Clinton gained 5 House members during his second midterm election because Clinton's popularity was so high at that time following the Monica Lewinsky scandal and things like that. So, but for the most part, typically the president's party loses seats. And also keep in mind that gubernatorial elections are also held during the midterm elections as well. So I hope that makes sense. Once again, any questions, please let me know. So, midterm elections, talking about Congress elections and things like that. Let's actually talk about congressional elections themselves. We've talked quite a bit about presidential elections. So, in the House of Representatives, you guys should know this from the congressional election. Or from the congressional lecture, not election. From the congressional lecture, the House of Representatives has 435 seats. You're allocated a certain number of seats based on population. You have a minimum of 1 per state. Every state has at least 1 House of Representatives member. So you have sparsely populated states such as Wyoming and Montana, or small states such as Rhode Island, that they only have 1 U.S. House of Representatives member. So it's kind of like having 3 senators in a sort of way, but not really. But what we're really going to talk about today in terms of elections is reapportionment and redistricting, and that's really important for the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives, from your congressional lecture, remember that Article 1, Section 2 calls for census and redistricting. State legislatures draw the boundary lines every 10 years after the census. If you remember from the congressional lecture, the lecture on Congress, there was originally 1 representative for every 30,000 people, and that was in 1789. Now, the population of the United States grew exponentially, and so they had to set a cap on this, and they set it at 435 members in 1910. So nowadays, the population is still growing, but we're not increasing the number of U.S. House of Representatives. We're just simply trying to fit a certain number of residents in each congressional district. So now there's 1 representative per 710,000 residents after the 2010 census. Apportionment, by definition, is the allocation of population into districts based on the census. So apportionment is just basically trying to fit these 710,000 residents into one congressional district. So that's basically what apportionment is. Districting is drawing the geographic lines based on population. So that's the actual physical act of drawing the lines. Now, there is such process. There is a process called gerrymandering, and this is what I really care that you know for your test. Gerrymandering is just the deliberate manipulation of boundaries to gain votes for party by dividing up opponents so the dominant party stays in power. I'm going to post a YouTube video that deals more with gerrymandering that hopefully illustrates a little bit more, but bear with me, I'll try to explain gerrymandering the best that I can. So gerrymandering is the deliberate manipulation of boundaries, trying to draw boundaries so that it favors your party, whether that be Democrat or Republican. So Republican states will try to gerrymander the districts or draw the districts so that Republicans have a good chance of winning that congressional district in the future for the next 10 years at least until the next census is taken. And Democratic states will do the same thing. They'll draw boundary lines that will favor the Democratic Party so that the Democratic Party can win congressional districts for the next 10 years. Now, gerrymandering can be only along political lines. So like I said, Republicans will draw Republican districts, Democrats will draw Democratic districts, so you can do it along political lines. The Supreme Court has ruled that you cannot do it along racial lines. Now, you cannot divide populations and put only blacks and African Americans in this congressional district, put only Hispanics in this district, so that way their votes are minimized. No, you can't do that. You can do it for political reasons. You can say, well, this area has voted Democrat this many times in the last election. We need to influence that district so it becomes a Republican district. Democrats will do the exact same thing. So you can do it along political lines. You cannot do it along racial lines. In the U.S., in federal law states that districts must be enclosed, and they must contain roughly 710,000 people, 700,000 people, roughly. So you can draw the lines however crazy you want. And I just want to show you this map real quick. This is an actual congressional district in North Carolina. It starts down here in this little red part here near Charlotte, and you can see how skinny it gets up here. And at certain points around here, it's only as wide as a highway. That's right there. And it goes all the way up into here, near Greensboro, all the way up into Durham. And this is the 12th congressional district. Republicans made this district in 1992 to put all the Democrats into this one district and then have all the other districts out here on the side be Republican. Now that favors the Republicans because the Democrats are now packed into one district and the Republicans have the rest of the districts in North Carolina. So it makes sense. Republicans would do this because it favors the Republican Party. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court looked at this and said, you can't really do this because what you're basically doing is you're packing all the minorities in North Carolina into one congressional district. And so remember, political is okay, racial is not okay. And the Supreme Court overruled that this district is too crazily drawn and done on a racial basis. So, if you want to look this up now, I should have posted. I thought I had a next slide on it, but I don't. You should look at what the 12th congressional district in North Carolina looks like now. And unfortunately, it looks very crazily similar, but it's not done on racial lines. So it's okay to draw these crazy districts as long as they're enclosed and contain roughly 710,000 people. So that's just one example. If you want to, you can also Google crazy congressional districts and stuff like that, and you'll see all sorts of congressional districts across the United States that have crazy drawn lines like this. So, all right. So that's the U.S. House of Representatives. Let's go ahead and talk just a little bit about the Senate. The Senate, we talked about this with the lecture on Congress, but in the Senate, remember, until 1913, federal senators were appointed by state legislatures. This was changed by the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment in 1913, you had direct elections. You had direct elections to be in the Senate. So you had to appeal to your voters or appeal to your constituents and then be elected to the Senate. You're elected to 6-year terms and it's staggered so that 1/3 are elected every 2 years. Just like with the lecture on Congress, I provided Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3 so you can see who's up for election and when. So that's just a little bit about the Senate. Now they're popularly elected. Just know that the 17th Amendment changed that. All right, so we're going to talk about campaign finance next time. but I definitely want to try to at least get into the cost of winning a seat in Congress and how much that exactly costs. So the House costs less than the Senate. Depends on whether you look at all candidates, members of Congress, or just winners. We talked about the incumbency effect, so let's just rehash that a little bit. The incumbency effect is the strategic advantage to run as an incumbent. You have name recognition, and incumbents generally tend to spend more than challengers. Because they're already winners, they're proven winners, they can go to their base and say, hey, I've already won, don't you want to bet on a winner? Give me, can you help me out with some more money and things like that. So the incumbents generally tend to spend more than challengers because they have more than challengers. Incumbency does not mean you automatically win, but it does give you an advantage. And remember, in terms, this was for the 2014 election, you can see here that Republicans had $235 million compared to the Democrats' $176 million. But in the Senate, the Democrats had more money, $116 million, compared to the $98 million for the Republicans. There's all sorts of money floating in politics. And that's just one example. And we're going to talk to you about it even more next lecture. But for a discussion board today, I want you to at least kind of pander at the idea of how much money really goes into publics. And how much money really goes into public elections. So just something to think about. Campaigns, talking just a little bit more about the incumbency effect here. An incumbent usually enjoys an advantage over the challenger because in terms of money and name recognition and things like that. 90% of U.S. House incumbents win, and 91% of U.S. Senate incumbents win. Every now and then, though, you do have an open election which lacks an incumbent. So that's just a little bit of idea on the incumbency effect. The incumbency advantage is that you've done constituent service. You've brought home the bacon. You've provided that pork and those earmarks that we talked about. You've done casework. You've helped out your constituents. You have the money. People like to bet on a winner, so you have money advantage as well. Remember the franking privilege we also talked about? You can send mail and you can say, hey, look how good of a guy I am. I've done this and I've done this and I've done this. You remember, you cannot say vote, but you can at least highlight how good you've been for the district itself. So that's the idea of the franking privilege. And you also get media exposure and name recognition, as I talked about. So that's the incumbency advantage, and that's what's led really to the incumbency effect. All right. So wrap it up with congressional elections. We talked about what primary elections are, what general elections are. We talked about the presidential elections. Then we wrapped up with the congressional elections. So a lot of it was on elections day and on the campaign trail. But next time we're going to talk about campaign financing. We're also going to talk about the actual act of voting. So while incumbency advantage helps in terms of money and campaign financing helps in terms of getting your name out and things like that, voting still does matter. So we're going to go ahead and talk about that next lecture. Next week is spring break. Week 10 will be on campaign finance and voting. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about your discussion boards. What are we doing for discussion boards this week in week 8? Number one, I just want you to answer the question, why do you think the rate of negative advertising has increased? We talked about how much negative advertising has really gone on now. Why do you think that's increased? I want to hear your guys' opinion. I kind of know the answer in sort of a way. I don't know the full answer. But I kind of want to hear what you guys want to think about negative advertising. Things to consider when answering. Think about the amount of money that goes into public elections, into politics. Think about lobbying money. Think about the media environment. Think about how negative the media is, and does that reflect into the campaign ads? Also think about the social environment. We've become a really negative society in many ways, so think about that as well. Why do you think negative advertising has increased in politics? Number two, does it concern you how much money it costs to win an election? Or does it discourage other candidates from running? Maybe other candidates have really good ideas and things like that. They just don't have the money to do it. Do you agree with how much money has been thrown into politics and things like that? So does it concern you about the money in politics? Finally, would you like to see a change from the Electoral College? We talked about the Electoral College, and we talked about how it would work if we adopted the system of Maine and Nebraska. You could also think about what if we just switched to the popular vote? What if we only counted votes total? Then how would that play out, and would that be a better system? So what would you like? Would you like to see a change from the Electoral College? Do you like the Electoral College? You can also answer that, hey, I like the Electoral College, let's keep it. But if you disagree with it, you should probably answer, should we abolish it? And what other election system would you propose? So something to think about in terms of how we get elected as well. So All right, I'm going to go ahead and wrap up today's lecture. Enjoy your spring break. Next week, if you're already on spring break and you're one of my high school students, I hope you're having a good week this week. And just answer the discussion boards when you get back to class next week, the 16th, I believe. Yeah, the 16th. So, all right, I'll go ahead and wrap up today's lecture, and have a good week.